Whoa there, buddy. I couldn't help but notice you were all alone on a Walp night. Did all your friends purge you for the dregs you are? Wish power gone down the drain? Living in Confuscious' garbage can? Well, now's your chance to make a blood clot. If season 5 was about forcing bleed and rupture into an arranged marriage, then season 6 is about rupture getting a divorce and Tremor going into their slut era minus the only sinner who may have a living wife. Both of these Walp IDs keep up the trend of merging Tremor with another status, and love it or hate it, they already look promising from their kits alone, with Walp being all the insurance I need to vouch for the rest. But if you must know why, let's make like Gregor's leg and get to brass tacks. Since he's canonically shorter on time, let's start with Nightingale's Capitano Gregor, the man that loves stabbing so much he skewers the ground with his every step. So it's only fitting that his kit revolves around inflicting wounds onto his targets with a whopping 3 statuses to match. Open wound, deep wound, and fatal wound are all effectively the same status at different stages. Open wounds like your Chili's triple dipper, your starter that'll inflict bind on some enemy every turn after it's inflicted, and trust me, they will not be going anywhere after one of those. And luckily for us, all 3 base skills know enough sangria to scream OW. In other words, you'll be inflicting this with every attack. That's especially nice since you get to the next stage when this sucker caps out at 2, because yeah, that X ain't fooling anyone. When Open Wound becomes Deep Wound at turn end, it gains a base stack of 3 and can apply more bind and applies bleed count on Tremor Burst. So that's right, we've got another Blemmer ID, and yes, he will feel right at home alongside Encorprioshu. More on that later. The only other deets worth noting are that you can't apply more Open Wound while the enemy has this, and Deep Wound will reduce its stack every turn. These mean that once you're here, you're not refilling the status by poking more holes. The only way to press is forward. And with a certain skill we'll get to later, you can do just that to turn Deep Wound into Fatal Wound. In a vacuum, this status will act the same as Deep Wound, except it'll apply bind based on the direct stack, but as we all know, Alan didn't really bite the dust. So we shouldn't be acting like his ass or his kid are existing in a vacuum. And to explain why, we'll need to look at his passives. Purge Enforcer of the Famiglie is Gregor's sin-powered passive that anyone familiar with Alan's fate in Library of Ruina will call ironic and sad. It comes with the perk of upping his Pierce power the turn after he causes any kind of HP bar to drop to 0, and will inflict defense power down with any non-ego move if he's faster than his opponents. All the more so for all the quicker. But the mainstay of both the passive and the kit is his Mercy Kill effect. After an ally attacks using a non-ego skill, if the enemy's core HP is less than 10%, you can use his skill 1-2 Mercy on the target. Oh, and the same happens if there's just a single staggered fellow who's screaming for a spearing. Different body, same story. Now, some of y'all might have noticed I said this goes off if the core HP is less than 10% when we technically don't have that confirmation yet. That's because all signs we have point this to being a finisher move. Alan has his own passive in Library of Ruina called Mercy, which gives him extra power against targets with less than 10 HP, and the Walp trailer has his assist attack outright killing the enemies it hits. But if that's not enough, the skill that procced is literally called Mercy. God, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who really cares? Which bypasses defensive skills and has a clause to gain coin power, and 2 clauses to deal more damage based on the enemy's HP value. So while the extra damage may make it tempting to say this threshold is higher, honey, that's just coward thinking. I'm a hard bet that PM will stay true to the lore and make this number 10%. That said, what the hell does any of this have to do with Fatal Wound? Well, that's a great question, my reliable straw man. We just gotta move on to the skills to complete the picture. While Alan's skill 1 is simple enough that just saying the keywords Blemmer, Haste, and Open Wound are enough to explain its entire deal, the skill 2 and skill 3 have more to show. Now, while all 3 skills will gain coin power based on Blemmer, these 2 have a few traits only they share, which is the first time an ID's been able to do that without needing a fancy guard mode. In addition, they both have their own conditions for proc and Mercy. If the enemy's HP is below a certain threshold, or if they have Fatal Wound, these skills' final coins will proc Mercy after the skill is complete. And the S3 will also proc it if the target's staggered, which is a nice reward for playing into Alan's exploit the gap fighting style. This is why Fatal Wound is important, since it not only helps with keeping the enemies slow on the ground and red on their mounds, but allows for these extra attacks that help sweep up the dregs. But of course, we need a way to make that Fatal Wound. That's where the S3-2 comes in. Should you lunge for an execution with the S3 on an enemy that has deep wound, Legor will shift to his ult, the Knight's All. This sucker is chock full of 4 UBs for no reason other than promising every effect goes off when you use it. And there are a total of 4 damage clauses that'll stab harder for every haste on Greg and bind on the target, how much core HP the enemy's lost, a more powerful buff if the enemy's at a low enough threshold, and whether the direct target has shields. So, that begs the question. Could we not have gotten this before Mares was obliterated from existence? I just feel like it would have been really helpful. Though if life must go on, and Alan proves it does. This skill also inflicts defense level down, gets coin power based on Blemmer, and will act like its counterparts in both inflict and burst tremor on Clash Win. And as for the coins, those will give you some reliable Blemmer P and C, give you some burst with a bonus based on the enemy's bind, and of course, change the target's deep wound to fatal wound, causing this to all come full circle. Oh, and before I forget, both of the skill 3s will convert Tremor into Tremor Hemorrhage. Here's a reminder of what it does for those that need it. Hope this helps. Now, this may be enough to get the vision of what the ID wants to do. Get Fatal Wound, and then show your enemies some Otis-style mercy. But there are 3 tiny sections we gotta consider before going on to the final assessment. Right, speaking of which, I took feedback from y'all after my last kit review and added a couple of segments. We might experiment for a bit, but I think you'll have fun with them, which is good. Because we gotta start with the 2 fun killers of this ID. Dire Straits is Gregall's Clashable Guard with an unbreakable coin that allows him to gain haste next turn, gets coin power based on Blemmer, and inflicts tremor on Clash Win. Now all that's fine and dandy, but it also reveals one catch with this ID. Its text says that when used, it allows Purge Enforcer of the Famiglie to trigger Mercy twice this turn. And if you think about it, that's a roundabout way of saying that unless you use this guard, that ally attack effect only gets to launch your move once per turn. Now to be fair, this is less of a nerf from the guard itself and more of an unfortunate truth that what we saw in the trailer was only possible because Gregor didn't use any attacks. It's by no means false advertising, but it is some classic city-flavored disappointment. Now some of the attentive folks might be saying that the skill 2 and 3 can pick up the slack, which is true if you're using a full team with Peggy, Leggy, Greggy, Weggy. Oh, I'm sure some people hated that. But his innate passive Painless Mercy will limit the total number of Mercy uses to twice per turn. So considering that not even Hagmail herself could order him to use a skill 1-2, that is as hard a cap as you can get. Does that make it bad? Nah! Not really. It's just the dose reality that this is not infinite stab gaming. But luckily, we can round out this kit with a pretty nice support passive. Aim for the Gap will allow the ally with the fastest speed to inflict defense power down on their target based on the speed difference when they're not using an ego. It feels situational enough that you won't always want to sideline him, but when you do want those defenses down and are using a Sank team, he's gonna be the clear choice. So with all that put together, let's get to something new. See, when I dropped my last kit review, I asked y'all what you were thinking about these, what you liked, and what could be improved. On the upside, a lot of the strengths of these videos were that they were a way to get to know how these traumatized chess pieces work without feeling dry. That's always nice. But a few notes were that folks would have loved to see more after the drop was released, and that my takes could sound too optimistic to the point of misrepresenting the kits. And you know what? I get it. While I think there's more gleam from the kits alone than people give them credit for, I ain't gonna pretend that this is as accurate without the numbers. Trouble is, this channel's still primarily for PM lore. And while I can potentially afford the time to review a kit, going for the full ID will guarantee taking time out of writing scripts about the world and characters of PM. So if I had to make the choice, I'd probably stop these videos altogether rather than wait a few days. And we've already got people for those kinds of guides anyway. But that said, I'd like to still introduce 2 new segments that'll show y'all why kits can be pushed reasonably far and be helpful for telling whether an ID is worth your time the moment it drops to help temper the FOMO. Well, I mean, this one's about Walp, so you're gonna pull for it anyway, but regardless, let's move on to the Vision Board. True to the name, this baby's here to show off what the vision of the ID is. Every single drop has a purpose PM intends that usually wraps around to how you play it across several turns. And while explaining's all well and good, I feel like a picture's worth 1,000 words. And the way things are going, that's probably about the size of a Kanto 12 drop, so may as well get ahead of the game, right? So here's the plan for Night Owl's Gregor. Phase 1 is all about getting that open wound on the field. While it's ideal to get to the deep wound as soon as possible, there's no urgency with that. Open wound ain't dropping the stack at the end of the turn, so even if we assume that each of his base skills only inflicts one open wound, you can afford to spread it out in a fight with more than one enemy. And once one of them stacks to deep wound, that's when you get to phase 2. This part's the most straightforward. Wait to get his heal 3, and then target the poor sap that is deep wound. Unless you're running with a Sank team, he should have an easy time targeting whoever he wants to change that deep wound into a fatal wound. While this also has the knock-on effect of applying Tremor Hemorrhage, carving this mega hole in the man opens up a lot of options in phase 3. Cause at this point, you can play with your food as much as you want here. Stack up your Mercedes bricks, bind, or have fun with any of your bleed or tremor plays. Either way, this phase ends only when the target dies, or you run out of fatal wound and need to start over. Ultimately, all roads will lead back to phase 1, just with a new battle state, and that's the long and short of the vision. So, now that we know what PM's intentions are for this ID, the final step is to address what could ruin those. This leads to the second new segment, what could ruin this? Yeah, it turns out when you make reviews entirely based on finding the vision of an ID, you get like an inherently optimistic read. So since the issue was less that I was trying to avoid negatives and more that I didn't really have a place to look for negatives, this is our chance to do exactly that. Helps to feel more balanced and all. Only issue is, introducing this segment during a Walp drop was a terrible idea. Cause this idea is solid. Like, if we need to measure how much charge unit could apply or what their SP healing effects were, that would be one thing. But most of the unknowns are easy to infer and are generally positive. Open Wound very likely only inflicts one bind to the enemy, while Deep Wound will apply the stack -1. The reason I believe this is the fact that making bind better on Open Wound or worse on Deep Wound would make it harder to keep enemies slow when Deep Wound is active. And even if Deep Wound is the only one that has the bleed count effect, I don't think PM would want any status they have to get worse in any way as it evolves. So with that in mind, there are 3 categories of poison that can ruin this or any other ID. There's the must mentions, bad clashing and low application, but considering that this ID is designed to sweep up weaker units, I don't see low application being a major issue. Then there are the second categories, which are the minor issues, not really death knells. Like if the Sin-powered passive is hard to proc. Since this one doesn't phrase its effect as lasting for a turn, like say Cassetti Merceau's, this is likely a stored Sin passive, meaning that as long as you have a full team, he'll likely get it easily. Although if it's Pride, yeah, Gregor could have a hard time getting it in solos. The last category is the drop-specific concerns, or anything that is specifically bad for this unit. For instance, if his speed range is low, like below 5 on average, that could get pretty bad. But the way I see it, the biggest factor here is how powerful Mercedes is. This move is his true keystone that all of his effects proc. I'm not expecting it to be super powerful, but since it can only be used twice per turn, I'd like this to have some decent power and be capable of getting, say, above a 15 without external buffs. Without it, the ID isn't bad, it's just a less interesting way to generate tremor hemorrhoids. Either way, here are the ego I'd suggest using with him, and while he can do well with any bind or bleed team, I'd be careful adding extra tremor units if you want to use hemorrhage. Most bleed units won't remove tremor count, but all tremor units will remove bleed count. So while you can add tremor to this team, it may be better to keep it below 50% of the units, or to just commit all the way and go full tremor and bind. But with all that said, we've finished everything relevant to one man living on borrowed time. Now, let's move to the other ID that's all about committing to a play. Zhong's office rep Ishmael is a tremor sinking ID that also happens to be the first discard ID Limbus has gotten in over a year. And dear God, I am glad it's a simple one. Discard IDs tend to be on the more complex side since the mechanic isn't terribly well explained. And since Walp IDs are also more complex and this issue in particular happens to have a card counting mechanic, I don't know about y'all, but I was prepared for this to be a rare 3-page drop. But thankfully, she only looks more complicated than she is. Here's the deal. This ID revolves around a resource called Bright, which spawns in at 0 potency and 3 count and loses 1 count at the start of every turn. Your main goal with this ID is to get that potency up to 5 as quickly as humanly possible. The reason is that Jishi will get offense level up and some major buffs, and I mean major buffs, for her skill 3-2 with it. We'll talk more about that skill soon, but first, how exactly do you build Bright? Well, as someone who took this week to study Hanafuda and discard IDs in order to learn how to explain this ID, building Bright with her is like playing Uno. All 3 of these passives are related to her 3 main attacking skills, and I'm sorry to the purists, but if I explain this ID in the game's own terms, it's only gonna make it so much more confusing. So ignore all the text on these skills for now. Here's how they work. Match colors on the first slot. We'll call these Wrath, Sloth, and Gloom cards. Whenever you use a skill, you'll get a card of the color in Sin that matches that skill the next turn. So if you use a Wrath skill, you'll get a red Wrath card. These cards empower the base skills that match their Sin type, but more importantly, you'll build Bright by repeatedly using the same Sin type over and over. And the more times you do it, the more you're rewarded every time, or at least twice in a row. But if you use a skill of a different Sin, that will get replaced with a different card. So the instant you stop using that same Sin over and over, you reset your momentum. In other words, match colors on the first slot. Let's make an example. If you use a Wrath skill on a turn without a Wrath card, you'll get a Wrath card. Simple enough. Then if you use another Wrath skill, even an Ego, you'll match the Sin and get Bright. The ID calls matching the Sin this way forming a hand. And if you use a Wrath skill a 3rd time, you'll get more Bright than the last turn. We may not know exactly how much Bright you get every time you do this, but let's assume the worst and say you get 1 Bright for matching the first time and 2 for matching the second time. If you manage to get 5 Bright, then you'll trigger the ID's skill 3-2 as an additional attack. A lot like Alger's Mercé. So let's skip over to that to see what happens when you match colors on the first slot. Okay, I think you guys get the idea of what to do. I'll stop saying it. Kozan is a skill that will trigger after you use Ishmael's first slot skill if Bright is at 5 potency or at 0 count. So yes, this will eventually proc over time even if you don't max out Bright. It has the same restrictions as Gregor's Mercé, and we'll first check to see if Ish has at least 3 Bright potency. If not, the skill bouncer kicks her out of using it and just gives her attack power up next turn as consolation. But if she does have at least 3 potency, Kozan gets additional effects. For every potency, Kozan deals more damage. At 4 potency, the skill gets more base power, and at max potency, it'll apply a tremor burst at the end. But none of that is the best part. While this is a 1 coin skill, that coin gets reused until it's flipped as many times as she has Bright. So at 3 Bright, it's a 3 coin skill. And at max Bright, it's a 5 coin skill. And every coin will apply shrinking count on hit and defense level down on heads hit. Here's your obligatory defense level to fragile conversion. After it's used, Ishmael loses all Bright, randomly picks a new card to use based on the 3 Sins available, and then gains some Bright potency for every coin that was available but not used. In other words, if she killed the enemy with 1 coin while at 3 Bright, she'll have 2 now. At least I'm pretty sure they're not saying it's 5 minus the number of coins used. That sounds like it'd be way too powerful. Either way, this is the core of the ID. Do all you can to use the same Sin over and over on Ishmael's leftmost skill slot, proc Kozan with Bright, and then roll with whatever hand you're dealt to do it again afterward. It's sickeningly simple to do if you want to leave it at that. So of course, we're not gonna leave it at that. Considering that all IDs have 3 skill 1s, 2 skill 2s, and 1 skill 3 in their rotation, it makes the most sense off the cuff to build Bright by spamming your skill 1 constantly. And while that's technically true, doesn't this sound just a little boring? Luckily, this is somehow both an ID that rewards playing smart, but can still work perfectly well with win rating. And that's from the discard mechanic she has. Now, cards on the table. I was expecting to have to explain all of discard to y'all on the chance this ID would have an insanely complex mechanic for it. I wrote and voiced an extra script, the full 9 yards. But this might just be the simplest discard implementation in the game. When used, all 3 of her attack skills will check the other skill in the slot. Reminder, discard only checks the 2 selectable skills when activating, see if it's the same color, and then delete it if it's not. In other words, every skill will attempt to give you a better chance of finding itself again next turn. So even if you do win rate, you might still automatically lock into building bright without any issues. That said, not all the skills are made equally for this purpose, so it would be an injustice to not explain the pros and cons of each. While all 3 skills will gain coin power based on the target's shrinking, the S1 Surugiri will inflict shrinking count and all the more on a heads hit. This means that this is not only the most reliable skill to build bright with, but also the most reliable one to build count with of the 3. On the surface, this makes for a solid starter if you want to stack count so long as you don't break your streak by getting staggered. Then there's the skill 2, Susuki Misdirection. Unlike the skill 1, this skill uses 3 coins and only applies shrinking potency, also adding more on heads hit. And it'll even add a cute little SP buff on the last coin. This one works as an offensive opposite to the S1. It's gonna melt through your sinking count fast if you commit to it, but will add a lot of potency and is still generally consistent to use. Plus, anyone that has Christmas Nightmare could also pull that out in an emergency on the off chance that female here can't maintain the chain. But personally, I'd wait to use this one for when the enemy has massive amounts of count. And then lastly, we have the skill 3, Sakura Sen. And while this one is the most volatile bitch of a skill to commit to, it also comes with the greatest reward. It applies shrinking potency and count with extra count on a heads hit, deals more damage based on bright potency, and will either convert the tremor on the target to decay, or deal more damage if it's already converted into something else. There is literally no downside to using this skill over and over, which is the catch. While it's possible to get 2 skill 3s back to back with the discard ID, it's far from a sure. And even giving Go Fishmail extra slots isn't gonna work since, again, Bright is only gained with the leftmost slot. So you'll have to get super lucky to roll into this one 3 times, even with discard. So, good thing Ishmael has 4 different Gloom Ego. Yeah, if you're willing to risk using Ego resources to build up your Bright instead of the base skills, then this could pay off well for you. At the end of the day, it's like what that man that told you to leave home forever said when you were 10. There's a time and place for everything. So to summarize, skill 1 for when you want count and you're not staggering, skill 2 for when you've got count and want better clashes, and skill 3 if you're willing to risk some ego resources to get that bright. Or hey, you know what? You could always just say screw it and play without focusing on bright. I ain't your aunt, live your life. But much like a fragrant tea, that brings us to the little notes that this ID also has. You might have noticed that Hanamail rewards getting heads hits. While it's not the mainstay of the ID, her skill 2 helps with keeping that SP high alongside her sin-powered passive. Stacking the deck will heal her SP when hitting with a Tails coin and deal more damage to enemies that are in low morale or panicking. Now, I originally thought this wasn't that good a passive since you'll rarely use it with a high SP build. But I mean, is it really that bad to have a safety net? If she's at low SP and can manage to avoid clashing, this can help her get back into action. It's not the prettiest passive, but it is good for keeping her in the positives. Speaking of, that's the theme of her support passive too. Relay will allow whoever has the least SP to heal some when they get a heads hit on a non-ego skill. Needing to hit heads makes it less of a safety net and more of a scaler, but hey, that still has its uses. And the last skill on deck is the Clashable Counter Shuffle Hands Floral Deck. Now this is more like the discard I know and love. This skill will discard some number of the lowest ranked skills from all of her slots, and that's about it discard-wise. In addition, if it's in the leftmost slot, it will randomize the hand next turn as if literally shuffling her hand. And it has the nice perk of randomly giving her bright potency and gaining coin power based on potency. And like the rest of the skill, the coins are fine, inflicting tremor potency and sinking count. Overall, I'd consider using this one if you've kitted out Ish with several skill slots and want to keep getting rid of skill 1s, but this feels like a skill you'd use if you're SOL on maintaining your chain and just want a chance to reset and get a little more bright in the process. Ain't really got much else to say about it. And finally, before we move on to the vision board, I should mention that Yu-Gi-Oh! Judge Ishmael can inflict Tremor Burst either when matching the skills or on her skill 3-2's 5th coin. The more you know. Now, let's make all that info look prettier. Despite how many words are on the ID, this drop is a pretty simple creature. You just need to match card colors as often as possible in order to build up Bright as quickly as possible in 3 turns. Once again, picking red as a starter is good if the skill is either absurdly good at clashing or you can otherwise use the skill without staggering. Yellow's good if you're willing to forsake count for extra damage and building SP. And blue's good if you have the resources to either use Snag Harpoon or one of Ishmael's other Gloom Ego. But see, then we get to phase 2, and I get the feeling some folks are gonna find this one complicated. Yeah, just unga bunga already! Once you load up Kozon with as much bright as possible, there's nothing to it. The skill is count neutral at worst, can't be defended or clashed against, and will deal a ton of damage with all its coin reuses. Once that's over, you'll return to phase 1, can choose the next hand based off of where you're at, and can get back to flipping the table again. It's just that simple. Now, let's see what could screw with her game. Guys, I don't know what to tell you, it's a Walp ID. If Project Moon screwed this up, Kim Ji-hoon would take Sinclair out back and snuff him out to send a message to all the other employees. Chances are it's gonna hit. But let's go at this assuming the worst for a lot of the variables, and let's assume a lot of what I said about this also applies to Gregor. If the potency, and especially the count application for an ID like this is bad, it won't be very useful since the ID gains coin power from shrinking. However, even if we assume the worst case scenario, both the skill 1 and skill 3 too will be count neutral since they can apply an average of 1 sinking count for every coin. So in theory, she could stick with using only the skill 1 to maintain count forever, even in the worst case. Now on the other hand, the skill 2 may be count negative no matter what, but the skill 3, as long as it doesn't apply just 1 count for each instance, will at least be neutral. And considering that Molar Ishmael was absolutely count positive in her skill 3, the odds are pretty good here. Nah, more than anything, Kozon having low coin power, or the skill 1 outright not clashing well, is what will mess up this ID. Kozon is the money move that we're meant to use at least once every 3 turns. So we want that to at least be as good as a rip space with W Corp IDs, or maybe a little weaker. And while the skill 1 isn't a make or break it for the ID, it removes Ishmael's most reliable tool to get maximum bright. But again, these are Walp IDs. Them getting good clashes are virtually guaranteed. Build-wise, the safest bet is to use anything for Ish's Zayn and Vav skills and splashing Christmas Nightmare and Bygone Days. But honestly, the build should be consistent enough that you can use any of the Tremor or Sinking Ego, or hell, Art or Blossom Star if you really need the clash power. As far as teams go, the Diechi will help out with the discard strats if you're in the Mirror Dungeon and get their gifts, but much like with old Peg and Greg, either commit to the Tremor build, go for sinking with minimal tremor, or a full aggression playstyle so that Oofy Heath just ain't lonely with its grape-flavored status anymore. Of course, I could always be wrong. Either way, I'll be pulling Walp drops on Wednesday night and we'll run a solid MD since that's probably all we can really do this go around. I swear, Kim Ji-hoon, I know you don't want to play Kanto 9, but please, for the love of God, do not make me stream it on Christmas. I mean, I will if you do, but please? Oh well, such is life. How about we get to the member and patron Q&A? Alright, today's question is from a good while ago. I have had to work through a backlog of these. Let's see. Since the kid is now dropped for Contempt Ryoshu, do you think Project Moon is going overboard with Tremor, or do you think having so many different Tremor types are a good thing? I mean, I think it's fair to say that Project Moon has been going pretty quick at making new Tremor types, considering that we got our first new one at the start of season 4, and we're 2 seasons later, and there's like, I don't know, I think a dozen now? 11, 12? Now, would I call it an issue? Not really. I feel like I've gone on the record saying that I really like differences in kind more than differences in scale. So while it does kind of feel like Tremor lags behind other statuses right now, it stays interesting because you combine or swap between all these different types. I don't know, maybe they need a little state of power creep sooner or later, but personally, I think it's fine and I'm still having fun with it. But at the same time, hey Project Moon, can we get a new Tremor gimmick that's not a new type before Heathcliff gets his next ID? Thanks.